Well met, travelers. Welcome to this, the first chapter of a history of Rome, where we shall begin our tale not with a bang but with a whimper, or perhaps more accurately with a shrug. For though the deeds of Romulus, the first king of Rome, are sung about by poets and told to children, that is not how he is remembered by the Romans themselves. No, because Romulus was hot-headed and violent, and it was he who slew his twin brother Remus in a fit of rage. And though his successors would go on to do far worse things, even they knew better than to murder each other. So what happened next? Well, let's find out together, shall we? Rome, 7 centuries before the founding of the city of Constantinople, and thus about 235 years before the birth of Christ. Because yes, we are going in reverse chronological order. Deal with it. Also, if you want to hear more stories like this one, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode when it comes out. The year before, Rome had been a city in mourning. Its first king, Romulus, had slain his twin brother Remus in a fit of anger over a border dispute. Now, whether or not Romulus was right to kill Remus is a moot point. He certainly believed himself to be in the right, but no one could deny that killing one's own brother was a dark deed. And so though Romulus was praised as a hero and founder of Rome, there was always a shadow hanging over his head. But now that 7 years had passed since those events, the citizens of Rome felt ready to move forward. They had grown accustomed to the sound of Romulus's booming voice and his hot temper, and they had come to respect his skill as a warrior and leader. Under his rule, Rome had fought many wars and had grown to encompass much of central Italy. But his passing left a void in the hearts of the people, a void that needed to be filled. Rome was still a very young city, less than a century old, and it was still finding its footing in the world. It needed guidance, stability, and most of all, it needed a father figure. Not everyone was ready to follow a woman into war, and though the Senate was full of men who had known Romulus since the days of the Roman tribes, there were also plenty of senators whose memories of the first king were hazy at best. The people of Rome were uncertain of their new reality, and they were afraid of what might happen next. This is why the name of the second king of Rome is remembered down through the ages, not for his great military victories or political reforms, but simply for being the man who brought peace to Rome in a time of uncertainty. This was Numa Pompilius. There are no grand statues of him in Rome. He has no special feast day. No poems are attributed to him, and yet every Roman child knew his name. Why? Well, because the name of Numa Pompilius meant stability, prosperity, and peace. And for a young Rome, that was worth more than any battlefield victory ever could be. You see, while Romulus was a great warrior and statesman, he was not known for his wisdom or piety. In fact, many of his religious policies were downright bizarre and only served to confuse the people. He established festivals honoring obscure deities and performed rituals that seemed strange and nonsensical. And while the Romans respected their king, they didn't necessarily understand him. With the passing of Romulus, the opportunity arose for someone to come along and bring clarity to the masses. And that someone was none other than Numa Pompilius. He was a man of few words and even fewer enemies. He was known throughout Italy as a wise counselor, and his services were frequently sought after by kings and princes. His counselors, he was called the second founder of Rome, and though he reigned for only 48 years, he made an indelible mark on the city that bore his name. Now, you might be wondering why I have chosen to tell the story of Rome from among the most boring kings in her entire history, but the truth is that Numa was anything but boring. Yes, he may not have been a great warrior or statesman, but he was a powerful mage. You see, while Romulus reveled in the physical aspects of warfare, Numa understood the importance of controlling the minds of his enemies. He knew that a battle could be won long before the first swords were drawn, and so he took great pains to learn the secrets of the mind, eventually mastering many forms of mental manipulation. In fact, his powers were so strong that he was eventually able to control the minds of entire nations. He used this power wisely, however, never resorting to deception or trickery. Instead, he used it to guide his enemies toward making peaceful decisions, breaking their wills to fight and bringing them together in harmony. This is why he is remembered as the man who brought peace to Rome. He didn't just rule over Rome, he made peace with all of their neighbors and brought prosperity to the city. So if you want to hear the story of how he did it, then I invite you to continue watching this series. But be warned, not all of his successors would follow in his footsteps. Some would use his wisdom for evil and others would resort to war and violence. But that, dear viewers, is a story for another time. For now, suffice it to say that the name of Numa Pompilius meant stability, prosperity, and peace. and for a young Rome that was worth more than any battlefield victory ever could be. When the news of Romulus's death reached the people of Latium, they were plunged into a state of chaos and confusion. They didn't know what to do or who to turn to for help. The gods, it seemed, had abandoned them. They needed a new leader, a strong and decisive ruler, who could guide them through these troubled times, but who could fill the massive boots of Romulus, who could lead Rome to new heights of glory and prosperity. The answer, as fate would have it, was a nobody. When the citizens of Rome gathered in the forum to discuss who should be their next king, most people advocated for a prominent member of the ruling class, someone who was rich and powerful and could easily command the loyalty of the army. But the leading contender was a nobody, a low-level official named Numa Pompilius. He wasn't particularly handsome or charismatic, and he had no experience ruling over a kingdom. In fact, he was so unknown that most people couldn't even remember what he looked like. And yet it was this very lack of prominence that made him the perfect choice for the job. You see, Rome had been through a lot in the past few years. They had experienced war and bloodshed and the death of their beloved king. What they needed now was stability and continuity. They didn't want a brash young ruler who would shake things up too much. They needed someone who would keep things running smoothly, and that's exactly what Numa did. He accepted the position of king without fanfare or ceremony. He didn't hold lavish feasts or throw gold coins from a tower. He didn't go around building monuments to himself or commissioning statues in his own image. He was too busy working, spending long hours in the palace reviewing reports and making decisions that would affect the entire kingdom. He didn't have time for vanity projects or empty gestures. He had a job to do, and he intended to do it well. The people of Rome noticed this, of course. They saw that Numa was a man of the people, a hard worker who was committed to serving his country, and they began to warm up to him, slowly but surely. At first, it was just a trickle, a few extra coins donated to the temple treasury, an extra prayer for the king and his family at the end of the evening. But soon it became a flood. The people of Rome loved their new king, and they showed it in every way imaginable. Merchants displayed their wares outside his palace, hoping that he would buy them and thus give their business a boost. Farmers brought their produce to the palace gates, hoping that the royal chef would buy it for the evening meal. And the children of Rome, they sang songs and made drawings for their king, which he proudly displayed in his office. Numa, meanwhile, never forgot the people who made him king. He visited the markets, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with as many people as he could. He attended festivals and public events, showing his support for the traditions and customs of his people. And whenever he saw an opportunity to improve their lives, he took it. He built schools and hospitals. He funded public works projects, and he instituted a fair and impartial legal system. In short, he was the perfect king, a man who was loved by his people and respected by his enemies. And it all started with a single conversation. One day, while Numa was walking through the forum, he stopped to chat with a group of elderly men who were sitting in the shade of a nearby building. They were discussing the future of Rome and lamenting the fact that there was no clear successor to Romulus. Numa listened patiently, nodding his head sagely, until finally one of the men turned to him and said, "Surely you must have some ideas on the matter, sir. After all, you are the king." Numa smiled. "I may be the king," he replied, "but I am only one man. I need your help to make Rome great." And with that, he outlined his vision for the future of the city. He talked about the need for stability and continuity, about the importance of hard work and public service, and about the value of tradition and custom. The old men listened, enraptured, and when Numa finished speaking, they rose to their feet and cheered. "Long live the king," they cried. "Long live Rome." And from that moment on, Numa had the support of the people behind him, and nothing could stop him from turning Rome into the greatest city in the world. Alright folks, that's it for chapter 1 of our history of Rome. I hope you enjoyed this little experiment of mine. If so, then please be sure to hit that subscribe button, so you don't miss an episode when it comes out. Until next time, thanks for watching, and remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, but we can watch it happen in just under 10 minutes. Chapter 2. The Rome Numa inherited. Rome in the year 753 was a city under siege. It was a place where only one road went in and one road came out. Its citizens still lived in tents and huts, far from the towering marble structures that would become its hallmark. Even more problematically, it was still just a collection of small villages rather than an actual city. There was no single unifying feature to the area, and barely any of the infrastructure that would become iconic, such as aqueducts, sewers, or roads. The Tiber River was too wide to cross, so Romans had to take long detours to get to the other side. Markets were few and far between, and the Forum, the central space where political life would later take place, was nothing but a swamp. Rome in this early period was a tough place to live, and even though it had recently celebrated its first consuls, its future was by no means assured. It wasn't until centuries later, in the 6th century BCE, that it truly began to flourish. This was due, in large part, to the second king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, whose deeds we'll explore today. But before we can discuss Numa, we have to talk about his predecessor, the legendary Romulus, whose story we covered in Chapter 1. When Romulus killed his twin brother Remus, after they fought over who should rule Rome, he set in motion a chain of events that would make his empire possible. Romulus inherited a small kingdom with only 3 tribes and a small group of patrician nobles. He expanded this domain through diplomacy, war, and strategic marriages, growing Rome's population and influence in the process. Romulus's soldiers were known for their skill in battle and their fierce determination. He was especially adept at expanding Rome's territory around the Albon Hill. The Sabines were the most formidable of these hill tribes, renowned for their strong military presence, but they were eventually defeated by Romulus's forces. In fact, according to Livy, Romulus's soldiers were so effective that they never lost a battle. They were also credited with defeating the Etruscans in a battle near the Tiber River. As a result of this victory, Rome's borders stretched all the way to the confluence of the Tiber and the Nile. Romulus further solidified his power by establishing the Senate, an advisory body initially composed of elders and former magistrates. It provided a platform for the elite class to participate in decision-making, laying the groundwork for Rome's future republican institutions. However, unlike the later Roman Republic, which historians consider a beacon of freedom, democracy, and law, Romulus's Rome was an oligarchy ruled by the rich and powerful. The masses of common folk, including freed slaves, had little to say about how they were governed. Romulus is often remembered as a great warrior, but he didn't just fight his enemies in battle. He brought them into his fold through marriage. His daughter Ilia married the king of the neighboring town of Alba Longa, and his son, Emilius, wed a Sabine princess, fostering alliances and strengthening Rome's ties with neighboring states. These unions not only enriched Rome, but also equipped Romulus with valuable allies. When he was ready to expand, his military campaigns were well supported. Despite these successes, however, Romulus, like many great conquerors, met an untimely end in battle against the Veienters. According to legend, he was killed by a soldier from the opposing side, after he left the ranks to retrieve his lost shield. Historians have traditionally dismissed tales of Romulus's heroic exploits, seeing them as little more than mythology. Instead, they point to archaeological evidence indicating that early Rome was a modest village. For example, excavations at the Palatine Hill, one of the 7 hills of ancient Rome, have revealed signs of habitation as early as the 10th century BCE. These findings suggest that Rome's legendary status was more aspirational than factual. But the idea of Rome as a collection of small villages may not be entirely accurate either. A recent survey of the Roman Forum suggests that the city was probably surrounded by a defensive wall during the 7th century BCE. While the structure uncovered was smaller than the famous later walls, it was still impressive enough to ward off invaders. Moreover, the Forum was much more built up than archaeologists expected. So while it's true that the early Romans weren't ruling over a mighty metropolis, they may have been in control of more land than modern scholars give them credit for. In any case, Romulus's death left Rome in need of a new ruler, but because he had no surviving sons, there was no clear successor. So the Senate turned to the next best thing, his brother-in-law, the king of Alba Longa. But when this man heard about the vacancy in Rome, he decided to seize the throne for himself instead. Now, Rome was bigger than it had been in Romulus's day, but it was still nowhere near as powerful as it would become. So the Senate wasn't going to stand for this kind of blatant disregard for their authority. They simply declared themselves the supreme power in the city and picked Romulus's sister, Tanaquil, as the new queen. Then they asked the Etruscans to give them a king, and their request was granted. The Etruscans sent the young Numa Pompilius to take the throne, as if the rapid succession of kings hadn't given away the instability of the situation. The very fact that the Senate asked the Etruscans for a king shows how little power they really wielded. If they could just ask for whatever king they wanted whenever they wanted, it means that they didn't have much power to begin with. Really, they were merely puppets in a game played by the nobility. But despite this unfortunate reality, Numa was a good king and the Romans loved him. One historian wrote that never in Rome was there so great a scarcity of anything as when Numa was king. That statement sounds like the author is saying that Rome was prosperous during Numa's reign, but technically speaking, it was quite the opposite. Food and resources were abundant, which made it easier for the Romans to focus on other aspects of their lives, like politics or business or building huge temples to their gods. While Numa's predecessor was a great warrior, Numa was not. In fact, he spent almost his entire reign trying to avoid war. According to Livy, he was slow to take up arms even when provoked, and he was widely respected for his commitment to peace. Numa favored diplomacy over military action and always tried to resolve conflicts peacefully. In fact, he negotiated a treaty with the Latins, another group of Italian tribes, that lasted for 40 years. But why was Numa such a peacenik? The answer lies in his character. Livy described Numa as naturally timid and nervous, icily frightened by the prospect of violence. This trait led him to value peace above all else. Numa knew what it was like to live in constant fear of attack, having seen what his predecessor had done to defend Rome. So instead of following in Romulus's footsteps, he tried to keep Rome out of future wars. Numa may have been the kind of guy who preferred cultivating an olive grove to cultivating an empire, but he still had to deal with Rome's neighbors, some of whom were less than friendly. Luckily, he had the support of the people. Living in a time when conquest and plunder were considered honorable professions, Numa stood out as a man who abhorred violence. Historian Plutarch explained that, unlike Romulus, who delighted in planning and executing military operations, Numa hated even planning them. Even when his advisors urged him to strike back at the Volsci, a warlike tribe that attacked the Romans on occasion, he refused, choosing to pay them off instead. This might sound like cowardice, but it was actually brilliant strategy. After all, Rome was still a relatively weak city-state. It couldn't afford to spend its limited manpower and resources on endless wars. Instead, Numa bought the Volsci off, focusing on internal improvements. One of Numa's greatest contributions was the establishment of the Flamen Dialis College, a group of priests responsible for maintaining the sacred fire of the god of hearth and home. This institution played a significant role in Roman religion, ensuring continuity and order. But Numa didn't just keep the peace within Rome's borders. He was also a champion of diplomacy, mending broken relationships with neighboring states and forging new alliances. He renewed trade with Carthage after Rome had previously waged war against the Phoenicians, and he established embassies across Italy and beyond. Numa believed that war was a last resort and always sought peaceful solutions to conflicts. He understood the cost of war and the importance of maintaining stability, a stark contrast to his predecessor Romulus, who had come to power through war and maintained it through strength. The Romans admired Numa's commitment to the common good, his piety towards their gods, and his ability to maintain social order. They celebrated him as the embodiment of wisdom and restraint. Under his leadership, Rome enjoyed an unprecedented era of prosperity and growth, laying the foundation for its future greatness. His reign marked a turning point in Roman history, a transition from a society of warriors to a more civilized and sophisticated state. It was a legacy that would endure for centuries. But now I want to hear from you. What do you think of Numa? Do you prefer your leaders to be fierce warriors or wise diplomats? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. We'll see you next time. In our last episode, we talked about the legendary founding of Rome by Romulus, who went on to become Rome's first king. And while it's pretty well known that he was followed by Numa Pompilius, not a lot is known about him today. So in this episode, let's talk about Chapter 3, who was Numa Pompilius. Welcome to my channel, a history channel. Now, since I usually focus on ancient Egypt, you probably know me as the guy who made a 20-part series on Akhenaten, King Tut, and Nefertiti. But I also love talking about other topics from time to time, and one of those topics is ancient Rome. In fact, I have a whole playlist of videos already recorded about ancient Rome, and I plan on making many more. So if you like ancient Rome, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of those episodes. Also, and now let's get into it. Numa Pompilius is often considered to be one of Rome's best kings, because he was apparently a wise and peaceful ruler who fostered culture, religion, and prosperity. But before I get into what he supposedly did during his reign, we should probably answer the most basic question of all: who was he? The sources tell us that he hailed from the Sabine town of Cures, which according to Livy was about 8 miles from the Porta Metronia gate on the Via Tiburtina road. The Sabines were a people who lived in the central Italian region of Latium, and while they shared common ancestors with the Romans, going back to the mythical Trojan hero Aeneas, they had been living in central Italy for long enough that they were generally considered to be an independent people. Although they were initially divided into several different tribes, they eventually came together to form a sort of confederation that acted as a united force against outside invaders when the Etruscans began to threaten the Italian peninsula in the late 7th century BC. The Sabines allied themselves with the Romans, with whom they would remain close throughout the next few centuries. By the time we reached the 6th century BC, when Numitus came to power, there was so much intermarriage between the Sabine and the Romans that it's hard to consider either group as being racially or ethnically pure. So it's no surprise that Livy refers to Numa as Latin, not Sabine, although it's worth pointing out that he may have been the first Sabine person to hold the office of king. It doesn't seem like Numa came from a particularly wealthy or powerful family, but they were known for their wisdom and piety, and they had earned quite a good reputation among the Romans. We know that Numa had at least 2 brothers, one older and one younger, whose names were presumably Amulius and Tatia. He also had a daughter named Anna, who was said to be extraordinarily beautiful, and a son named Pomponius, who sadly died young. It seems likely that Numa's father's name was Pomponius, and that's where the family got its gens or clan name from, but we don't know his name. Livy does tell us that one of his relatives, a man named Titus Pomponius, was consul in the year 493 BC, so it looks like these Pompeians had been in Rome long enough that one of them could be elected to the highest political office in the city. Now, at this point, we need to discuss the famous story about how Amulius tried to kill Numa as a baby, out of fear that he would usurp the throne. This is recounted in both Livy's and Plutarch's histories, but there are some differences between the 2 versions. According to Livy, Amulius was motivated entirely by self-interest. He feared that Numa would take the throne away from his legitimate heir, so he tried to kill him, but Numa's nurse escaped and took the baby to safety. Later, when Amulius was killed in battle with the Veientes, Numa was able to return safely to Rome. On the other hand, Plutarch tells a much more complex tale. Apparently, Amulius consulted with the oracle of Delphi about whether he should make Numa his heir, and the god's answer was that he shouldn't, because there would be another contender for the throne after him. Instead of taking these words to mean that neither he nor Numa would be king after Romulus, Amulius thought they meant that somebody else would come along and take the throne from Numa. So, out of fear that this might happen, he plotted to kill Numa as a baby, but then he changed his mind at the last minute, and instead he just put him up for adoption. Both stories end with the child being taken in by shepherds who raised him as their own, though, and it's only by chance that he ever ends up becoming king. As you can see, there's a lot of room for interpretation here, and I think it's possible that both stories are partly true. I'm not saying that Amulius definitely wanted to kill Numa, but I do think it's possible that he hoped that by giving him up for adoption, Numa would never find out who he really was, and Rome would never have a second king. Anyway, the boy who would grow up to become Numa was eventually found by a group of Roman nobles who brought him back to the city and raised him as their ward. Livy says that they were doing this with Amulius's permission, but Plutarch claims that they did it in secret. Either way, it wasn't long before he returned to live with his real father, who had given up hope of ever seeing him again, and it was around this time that Numa developed his lifelong devotion to the gods and philosophy. Both historians agree that he was tutored by the philosopher and statesman Pythagoras of Sabine, and after studying under Pythagoras for several years, he went on to travel the Mediterranean, visiting places like Egypt and Greece, where he continued his philosophical education. While he was gone, his father died and Amulius became king. However, Amulius only ruled for 1 year, and when he died, it was time for the Romans to choose a new king. Most people wanted to make Tarquinius Priscus king because he was rich, influential, and already acting like a king. But when they went to invite him to accept the crown, he refused, saying that the kingship should go to the most pious person in Rome, and that person was Numa. Soon after, Numa became the second king of Rome, and he reigned for 43 years. Of course, in addition to being a philosopher king, Numa was also a warrior king. He fought against the Etruscans, the Latins, and the Aqui, and he even rescued the city of Ardea from the Etruscans after they besieged it. It is also said that he defeated the Goths and the Volsci and extended the borders of Rome all the way to the Tiber River, but he is probably best remembered for his contributions to Roman religion and culture. During Numa's reign, the Romans built their second temple to the god Janus, and they also dedicated the grove of the Lupercal to the she-wolf that nursed Romulus and Remus. He established festivals honoring the gods, February, March, April, May, and October. And he introduced games called Nono Ludi Romani, held every 5 years in his honor, which included chariot races, athletic competitions, and theatrical performances. He also reorganized the College of Priests, created for new priesthoods, and gave the Vestal Virgins more elaborate garments and a bigger building. Numa also set up the first mint in Rome, and he started issuing coins stamped with his own image. Although it's worth pointing out that we don't actually have any examples of these coins today. All of this makes Numa sound incredibly powerful, but the truth is that he didn't want to be king in the first place. In fact, both Plutarch and Livy tell stories about how he didn't even know how to put on the crown jewels properly, and he had to ask his wife for help, because he was too afraid to touch the sacred objects with his own hands. This reluctance to take on such an important role was, of course, seen as a virtue in a king, because it showed that he wasn't interested in power for its own sake. But it's still worth pointing out that he was clearly uncomfortable with it. There's also a story about how Numa couldn't bring himself to wear royal robes, until he sacrificed a white bull to the god Jupiter, and even after he was allowed to do this, he still wore simple clothing while he performed his religious duties. So I think it's as fair to say that Numa preferred to be seen as a holy man rather than as a king. But perhaps the most interesting thing about Numa is that the Romans chose an outsider to be their king. This wasn't like choosing a member of the ruling class to be monarch. They picked a Sabine, a non-Roman foreigner. So why would they do that? Well, first of all, remember that the Sabine people were closely related to the Romans, going back to their supposed Trojan ancestors. So it wasn't like picking a complete stranger. There were decades of marriage between the two groups, and the children of those marriages were considered Roman. Plus, the Sabines were allies of Rome, and they had proven themselves to be fierce fighters who were willing to defend the city. So maybe the Romans felt like they needed somebody strong to lead them after Romulus's death, and they thought that a Sabine would be the best choice. Or maybe they just liked the Sabines. Plutarch mentions that the Romans regarded the Sabines as being especially dear to them, and they said that it was thanks to the Sabines that Rome became civilized. So perhaps they felt like having a Sabine king would be a good way to honor the group that helped make Rome what it was. Whatever the reason, the Romans showed that they were unafraid to look beyond their own borders when searching for a great leader, and they rewarded Numa for his wisdom, piety, and humility. So those are the main points of Chapter 3, Book 1 of Livy's History of Rome, which tells the story of the legendary founding of Rome through the reign of Numa Pompilius. If you're enjoying my videos about ancient Rome, be sure to subscribe because I have so many more coming up. And as always, if you want to know more, you can check out my full written version on my blog, which has lots of extra details and references that I couldn't fit into this episode. And if you'd like to support my work, you can check out my page. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Chapter 4, Marriage to Tatia, A Human Side. This is Rome's second king, Numa Pompilius. This is a new series where we look at the kings of Rome from the legendary period. I will try to combine the various semi-mythical stories about them to form a more complete picture and see what kind of person they were. Now, in this episode, we will be covering his youth up until he married Tatia, the daughter of Romulus. So if you are excited, then hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss any episodes. After defeating the Albans and laying the foundations for Roman dominance in Latium, Romulus now turned his attention towards finding suitable wives for his warriors. He invited the neighboring kings to a festival in Rome, and during this festival, there was an athletic competition. Among these competitors were two men from the Alban race, who had come seeking revenge for their nation's defeat. They hoped to win the competition and impress the Romans enough so that they would be accepted back into Romulus's favor. But these hopes were quickly dashed when one of them, a certain Hercules, was killed in a chariot race by a Roman charioteer named Orestes. Now this was not done on purpose, but the spirit of revenge still took hold of the other Alban, whose name was Mythonius, and so he challenged Orestes to a boxing match, which he lost. However, he refused to accept defeat and claimed that he was being held back by the weight of his armor. And so it was decided that both boxers would have to fight in the nude. And once again, Mythonius was defeated and was forced to flee. Now, as punishment for his crimes, Romulus banished him from Rome and commanded that he never enter Italy again. However, after hearing his sad tale, the gods took pity on him and gave him the power of prophecy. From that day forward, Mythonius lived as a hermit and became known as the Cumaean Sibyl. Now, while she was a minor figure in the original story, In later tradition, her role was greatly expanded and she was made a major player in the founding of Rome. She was said to have arrived in Italy before the Trojan War and settled down on the shores of Lake Avernus in Campania. There, she spent her time composing poetry and making sacrifices to the gods. One day, however, Apollo came down and ravished her, and she bore him 3 children, all of whom became famous as oracles. The eldest was the Cumaean Sibyl, who inherited her mother's gift of prophecy. The second was the Tiburtian Sibyl, who settled on Mount Tiber and prophesied the coming of the Messiah. And the youngest was the Persian Sibyl, who traveled east and foretold the destruction of Babylon. Now, as much as I love this story, let us get back to our main characters. After having secured his western border with the Latins and Etruscans, Romulus now set out to do the same to the east. He marched against the Volsci and conquered their lands, then returned to Rome and subjugated the city of Ardea. But shortly after, the Sabine king Titus Taminus attacked Rome, hoping to avenge his brother's defeat. Again, Romulus defeated the Sabines and forced Taminus to flee. But the Roman victory had come at a great cost. Both Romulus and his brother Remus had been wounded, and this worried their father Amulius greatly. He knew that the next attack would probably be from the Hernicni, who were allies of the Sabines, and he feared that his sons might not survive another battle. So he called an emergency meeting of the Senate, and told them that he would abdicate in favor of whoever managed to marry a daughter of the king of the Hernicni. This would secure a powerful alliance for Rome and ensure its safety from future attacks. The brothers were eager to secure the throne for their bloodline, but they could not agree on who should marry Tatia. In some versions of the story, Romulus wanted Remus to marry Tatia because he was the younger and therefore weaker brother, but in others he wanted Tatia for himself, because she was the most beautiful of the sisters. However, in the end, neither of them won her hand, for when the twins arrived at the court of the Heraclidae, they were both smitten with Tatia, the youngest sister, and no amount of arguing could convince either of them to back down. To solve this dilemma, they left the decision up to the girls, and both Romulus and Remus ended up marrying the Albalong sisters. Life with Tatia was everything that Romulus had dreamed of. It was quiet and peaceful, centered around the family and dedicated to the gods. They built a house near the Forum where Romulus raised his cattle and Tatia cared for the household. Their evenings were spent enjoying the company of each other and their 5 children, and they took great joy in watching them grow. It was also during this time that Romulus established many of Rome's religious customs. Every morning he sacrificed to the gods, and every evening he offered prayers and incense to the spirits of the dead. He also instituted the Lupercal Cave Festival in honor of the She-Wolf that had nursed him and Remus. However, tragedy struck when Tatia died. She had been ill for a long time, and the doctors could not help her. As she lay dying, Romulus stayed by her side and promised to take care of their children. Then, as the sun rose, she passed away. Grief-stricken, Romulus buried her in the Forum, then returned home to take care of his children. But he could not shake off the feeling that he had failed his wife. He felt that he had not given her the respect and devotion that she deserved, and he blamed himself for her death. From that day forward, Romulus grew distant and withdrawn. He no longer took pleasure in his work or his children. All he could think about was Tatia and how he had failed her, and so he began to neglect his duties as king. People started to notice that he was not the same man that they had elected. He had become quiet and contemplative, and he seemed to be searching for something. The worst part was that nobody could help him. His friends and family tried to cheer him up, but nothing seemed to work. Even his priests told him to stop wasting his time on useless grief, but Romulus could not listen to them. He felt that his wife's death was a punishment for his pride and ambition. He had always thought that he was invincible, but Tatia's death had shown him that even kings can be defeated, and so he threw himself into his work, trying to find a way to make Rome invincible. He reformed the army and made it bigger and stronger. He also reformed the government and made it more efficient and fair. And he did all of this with the help of his friend, the philosopher Pythagoras. Together they created a system of laws that protected the rights of the citizens and made Rome a model of justice and order. However, despite all of his accomplishments, Romulus was still haunted by the memory of Tatia, and so he did something that shocked everyone. He left Rome and went to live in the woods. He built a small hut and spent his days wandering the forest and talking to the trees. He felt that nature was the only place where he could find peace, and so he stayed there for the rest of his life. And this is why the Romans considered Romulus to be the father of their religion. He showed them that the gods are everywhere, and that even in death they are with us. This was brought to you by our supporters. We don't do sponsorships or paid ads. We just rely on the generous support of people like you. If you would like to support us and get early access to videos, then you can check out our support page. But for now, that does it for me. If you enjoyed this video, then please like and share it, and if you haven't already, then please subscribe. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Wisdom is indeed a worthy pursuit, my friends. It will forever enrich your life and deepen your relationship with the divine. But remember, it's not just about accumulating knowledge. True wisdom comes from embracing a lifestyle guided by faith, reason, and a profound connection with the source of all being. There are some things that can help us find our way and gain a deeper understanding of divine wisdom. Let's discuss these 14 things. 1. Embrace divine guidance through faith. To embark on the path of seeking divine wisdom, wholeheartedly embrace divine guidance by nurturing your faith. Believe in the existence of a higher power and have trust in its benevolent nature. Cultivate a deep sense of wonder and openness to receive divine insights and revelations. As you align your heart and mind with faith, you'll unlock the doors to spiritual wisdom, allowing its transformative power to flow into your life. 2. Study sacred texts. Immerse yourself in the timeless teachings found in sacred texts such as the Bible, Quran, or other holy scriptures relevant to your faith tradition. Delve into their profound verses, contemplating their hidden meanings and applying their wisdom to your daily life. Allow the words of ancient sages to illuminate your path and guide you toward a deeper understanding of divine truths. 3. Trust your intuition. Your intuition is a compass pointing towards what is right. Trust your gut feelings and inner voice, for they often serve as divine whispers guiding you along the path of wisdom. When faced with choices, take time to listen to your intuition. It may lead you to unexpected opportunities or resolutions that align with divine principles. Seek counsel from experienced, godly individuals. Reach out to mentors, spiritual leaders, or wise individuals who have walked the path of faith for many years. Their experience and insight can offer clarity in times of uncertainty. By listening to their counsel, you'll gain valuable perspectives that resonate with divine wisdom, helping you make informed decisions and navigate life's challenges. 5. Wisdom empowers you to view situations from a divine perspective. When you adopt a divine perspective, you see beyond surface appearances and perceive the interconnectedness of all things. This awareness allows you to respond to challenges with grace and understanding. You realize that every situation is an opportunity for growth, offering valuable lessons and contributing to the greater good. 6. Be patient. Divine guidance often arrives when you least expect it. Patience is key to receiving wisdom. Trust in the perfect timing of life and remain open to unexpected sources of insight. Sometimes the answers you seek may come through serendipity or in moments of quiet reflection, reminding you that wisdom can be found in the most unassuming moments. 7. Embrace contemplation. Set aside dedicated time for contemplation and meditation. In moments of solitude, allow your mind to wander, exploring the depths of your thoughts and connecting with your inner wisdom. During this time, you may encounter profound insights or have a sudden realization that brings clarity to your situation. 8. Prayer. Prayer is a powerful tool for seeking divine wisdom. When you pray, you open yourself up to a higher source of knowledge and understanding. Whether you pray for guidance, strength, or clarity, prayer has the power to connect you with divine wisdom and bring light into your path. Remember that sometimes the answers you seek may lie beyond the realm of your own understanding. And in those moments, prayer can serve as a guiding light, leading you to the wisdom you desire. 9. Mindfulness. Mindfulness involves paying attention to the present moment without judgment. By embracing mindfulness, you become more attuned to subtle signs and whispers of guidance. You might notice patterns, coincidences, or intuitive nudges that point you in the right direction. For instance, you may suddenly recall a relevant quote or have a vivid dream that offers insight into your situation. 10. Reflect on personal experiences. Look back on your life experiences, both joys and challenges, and reflect on the lessons you've learned from them. Each experience holds valuable insights that can shape your future decisions. By identifying these lessons and applying them to new situations, you'll navigate life with greater wisdom and resilience. This practice allows you to extract valuable lessons from every facet of your life, fostering personal growth and deeper insights into the tapestry of existence. 11. Cultivate a supportive community. Surround yourself with a community of like-minded individuals who are also on their own spiritual journeys. Sharing your insights and experiences with others can lead to profound revelations, In a supportive environment, you'll gain different perspectives and learn from those who have walked similar paths, creating a network of collective wisdom. Note 12. Document your insights. Keep a journal to record your spiritual insights, dreams, and any moments of divine inspiration you encounter. Revisiting these entries over time will help you track your spiritual growth and recognize recurring themes or patterns. Journaling serves as a powerful tool for self-reflection and spiritual development, allowing you to revisit your insights whenever needed. Number 13. Ask for divine guidance. When you earnestly ask the divine for guidance, you open the doors to receiving wisdom beyond your own limited understanding. Approach prayer with humility and sincerity, expressing your desire for clarity and direction. Trust that the universe will conspire to bring the right people, resources, or opportunities your way, leading you to the wisdom you seek. Number 14. Study Egeria's journey. Read about the legendary figure Egeria, known for her deep wisdom and spiritual insights. Study her journey and the challenges she overcame, and reflect on how her story can be applied to your own life. Her experiences offer timeless lessons that can guide you on your path to finding wisdom as you continue your journey towards seeking divine wisdom. Keep in mind that it's a lifelong pursuit that unfolds in beautiful and unexpected ways. Embrace the wisdom you discover within yourself and the divine guidance you receive, allowing it to illuminate your path and bring you closer to your higher purpose. May your quest for wisdom lead you to profound insights, personal growth, and a deep connection with the divine. If you enjoyed this video, please share your thoughts below. Your feedback means a lot to us. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Thanks for watching, God bless you, and we'll see you next time. This is chapter 6 of my history of Rome, covering the reign of Numa Pompilius. Numa was born in the Sabine town of Praeneste. His father was a descendant of the legendary Trojan king Aeneas, while his mother was descended from the Albans. He was therefore half Trojan, half Italian, which may have helped him rule over all of Rome. As a young man, he married a Vestal virgin named Tatia, with whom he had 2 sons, Pomponius and Numius. However, these are the only members of his family who appear in tradition. His father, his mother, even his wife, all disappeared from the narrative after this point. So it seems that Numa wanted to be a sort of Romulus, founding his own dynasty, a dynasty separate from the existing royal line. After the death of Romulus, there was a succession crisis. The patricians wanted the next king to be of Romulus's bloodline, while the common folk wanted a king from among themselves. Numa was chosen by lots, and so became the second king of Rome. Now, despite his royal lineage, Numa was no tyrant. In fact, he was more like an Italian Job than an Italian Caesar. You see, Numa was one of those leaders who appears only at the end of books. In real life, he ruled for 43 years, longer than any other king except for his supposed ancestor, King David. But we find very little about what he did during his long reign, aside from one great project, creating the foundations of Roman law. The main source for his legal reforms is Livy, who tells us that Numa took 3 steps to bring law to Rome. First, he established the 12 tables of the laws. This was done through a sort of committee of senators, whose job it was to go around the city asking people what their complaints were. They found that most people complained of being oppressed by their equals or their superiors, so the 12 tables provided legal guidance in such matters. Second, he set up the office of Pontifex, whose job it was to explain the laws to ordinary people. Finally, he set up a court system where commoners could sue patricians and vice versa. So that was how Numa made Rome into a city of laws. However, Livy glosses over a major problem, namely that these laws don't seem to have been written down anywhere. We only know about them because later Romans wrote about them. If you want proof of this, look at the fact that many of the provisions attributed to Numa, such as the law of primogeniture, didn't actually get enacted until much later. And there's a reason for that. You see, ancient Rome was a society without a codified legal system. Rather, its laws developed gradually over time, and most of the time, legal disputes were settled through private arbitration. What Numa did was to encourage this trend. Instead of having the courts decide cases based on precedent, he wanted them decided based on fairness. This may sound a bit odd to modern ears, but you have to remember that back then, the concept of justice wasn't as well developed as ours. Back then, laws were considered fair if they were egalitarian. By this standard, Athenian democracy was fairer than Roman oligarchy, and slavery was fair because slaves were considered property. So when Numa encouraged Romans to settle disputes through arbitration rather than litigation, he was seen as a champion of justice. He also set up a system of fines, which citizens had to pay when they committed crimes. These fines were intended to compensate the victims, but they were also a way of deterring future crimes. The system worked surprisingly well, and for several centuries, Rome remained one of the few Italian states without a standing army. Why? Because Numa spent much of his reign encouraging Romans to resolve disputes peacefully. According to legend, he rescued 2 men from a burning building, saying, "Is this the way you serve the gods? By shedding your brother's blood?" Now, mind you, this doesn't mean that Romans under Numa never went to war. It just means that they preferred peace. And here we come to Numa's third great reform. According to Livy, Numa introduced civic order into Rome. Before Numa, Roman society was run through sheer force of will. Romulus literally kidnapped Sabine women in order to make them wives for his warriors. But Numa brought order to the city, both social order and political order. He created the Senate, whose job it was to advise the king on policy matters. He also founded many of Rome's most important religious festivals, including the Lupercalia, the festival of Lupa, the she-wolf that suckled Romulus and Remus. He also founded the Argai, a festival held every 5 years in honor of the river gods. Numa was also responsible for building Rome's first temple, the Temple of Janus, which was also used as a treasury. Moreover, he founded the College of the Pontiffs, a group of priests whose job it was to oversee Roman religion, and according to Dionysius, he also founded the College of the Augurs. And while the traditional date of Numa's reign makes it impossible for him to have been a contemporary of Pythagoras, some scholars believe that he visited the Greek East and was influenced by Pythagorean thought. If true, he would have been the first Western leader to study in the East, although Pythagoras himself studied in Egypt. Now, one might think that, with all this peace and prosperity, Romans forgot about war altogether, but that was far from the case. During Numa's reign, Rome fought for wars against the Etruscans and the Sabines, and it was during one of these campaigns that Rome got sacked. Livy writes that the sack of Rome happened after the Latin War, which ended in 509 BC. The Gauls attacked and pillaged the city, but soon left. According to Dionysius, though, this attack was part of a larger Gallic invasion. Luckily, the Romans managed to defeat them, and so the Gauls left Italy. So whoever sacked Rome, it wasn't the Gauls. What about Numa? Well, he survived the sack, but soon died of old age. It says that he spent his last years traveling all over Italy, perhaps to escape the violence of Rome, perhaps to become a sort of prophet. One day he climbed Mount Alban, where he met the Alban king Albolus. When Albolus asked Numa what he was doing there, Numa answered, "I have come to show myself to you, since I am going to depart from this life." Then he walked toward a nearby grove, sat down on a stone and gave up the ghost. Alb Mod Maudlingus buried him in that same grove, and later built a temple on top of it. Okay, so why does he get the title of Lawgiver? Well, it's not just because he was a peaceful king. After all, the Athenians also considered Pericles the lawgiver despite his warmongering. For me, the title fits Numa because he genuinely tried to create a better world. He was the first Roman to do so, and he did so with his head, not with his sword. That's why he gets the title of Lawgiver. And now I need to thank my supporters, especially those of you who donate monthly. You're awesome. Thank you. And if you too want to support this channel, you can join my membership program or you can support me through donations. The links are in the description. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, because this way you won't miss any of my videos. This is chapter 7 of my book, The Roman Revolution. This chapter is called Religion as the Foundation of Rome. If you'd like to read along with me, you can find the text in the description or comments below. And if you're new here and would like to get notifications when I post new chapters, please subscribe so you don't miss out. And now, back to our story. The Romans were deeply religious people, and their religion was more than just a set of beliefs and practices. It was a way of life that permeated every aspect of Roman society. Religion was essential to the identity and culture of the Romans, and it played a central role in their daily lives. Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, recognized the importance of religion and made it one of the cornerstones of his reign. He believed that the gods were the ultimate source of the city's power and prosperity, and he was determined to make Rome a religious center of the universe. Numa's deep belief in religion stemmed from his own personal experiences. He had seen firsthand the destructive power of the gods, and he knew that they could just as easily turn their wrath on Rome as they had on Troy. But he also believed that the gods could be appeased, and that they could even be benevolent towards those who honored them properly. Numa wanted to create a Rome that was not only powerful and prosperous, but also harmonious and peaceful. and he believed that religion was the key to achieving that harmony. He established major priesthoods and introduced new rituals and festivals to honor the gods. He built the first major temple in Rome, the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus, and he appointed the first Pontifex Maximus, which was the chief priest of Rome. He also established the Flamens, who were priests of Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus. These priests were responsible for maintaining the sacred fire that symbolized the presence of the gods in the city. They also served as advisors to the king on matters of religion, and played an important role in the public rituals and festivals. In addition to the male priesthoods, Numa also established the Vestal Virgins, who were a group of women who were dedicated to the service of the goddess Vesta. Their main duty was to keep the sacred fire burning in the temple of Vesta, and they were required to live a pure life and remain virgins until their 30th year. The Vestal Virgins were highly respected in Roman society, and their service was considered a great honor. They were given special privileges and their opinions were valued, but Numa did not stop there. He went on to establish several other priesthoods and religious institutions that played an important role in Roman religion. He created the Ludi Romani, which were the Roman public games that were held in honor of the god Jupiter. These games were a major part of Roman religious life, and they included chariot races, athletic competitions, and theatrical performances. Numa also established the Salii, which were a group of priests who performed a sacred dance in honor of Mars. They were said to have been the first to introduce the cult of Mars to Rome, and they played an important role in military celebrations. In addition to establishing these priesthoods and religious institutions, Numa also made several other significant contributions to Roman religion. He introduced the use of sacrifice in religious rituals, and he established the first Flaminica, which was a college of priestesses who assisted the Vestal Virgins. He also made efforts to incorporate the local cults and traditions of the people he conquered into Roman religion, which helped to create a sense of unity and harmony among the diverse population of Rome. By the end of Numa's reign, Rome had been transformed into a religious center. The city was filled with temples and priests who were dedicated to the service of the gods. The citizens of Rome were deeply religious, and they participated in the rituals and festivals with great enthusiasm. Numa's vision for Rome as a harmonious and prosperous city had become a reality. However, it's important to note that Numa's approach to religion was not without its critics. Some members of the Roman nobility, who had traditionally been polytheistic, were uncomfortable with the introduction of new gods and rituals. They saw it as a threat to the traditional Roman way of life, and they resisted Numa's reforms. Despite this opposition, Numa remained steadfast in his commitment to making Rome a religious center. He believed that it was his duty as king to honor the gods and to ensure the prosperity of his city. He knew that the gods were the ultimate source of Rome's power, and he was determined to keep them on the side of the Romans. Although we have very little historical evidence to go on, it seems that Numa's approach to religion struck a chord with the people of Rome. His emphasis on peace and harmony resonated with a population that had known only war and violence for generations. By introducing new rituals and festivals, Numa gave the people of Rome a sense of stability and continuity that they had never experienced before. The establishment of the priesthoods also gave people a sense of purpose and belonging. It created a class of religious specialists who were dedicated to the service of the gods and the well-being of the city. Numa's influence on Roman religion was so profound that his reforms continued to shape the religious landscape of Rome for centuries. His emphasis on the importance of religion in public life led to the construction of more temples and the creation of more priesthoods. His introduction of new gods and rituals became an integral part of Roman religious practice, and his legacy as a pious and devout king lived on in the annals of Roman history. Another thing you should know about Numa is that he firmly believed that Rome's strength came not only from its armies, but also from the favor of the gods. He understood that the gods were a powerful force that could be used to enhance Rome's power and influence, so he made every effort to keep them on Rome's side. Numa knew that the gods were not to be taken for granted, and that they needed to be honored and respected. He understood that the gods were a powerful force that could be used to enhance Rome's power and influence, so he made every effort to keep them on Rome's side. Numa's approach to religion was practical and pragmatic. He was not a dreamer or a visionary. He was a leader who was focused on the task at hand, and he knew that religion could be a powerful tool for achieving his goals. One example of Numa's pragmatic approach to religion was his decision to incorporate the local cults and traditions of the people he conquered into Roman religion. This was not simply a matter of tolerance. It was a shrewd political move that helped to create a sense of unity and harmony among the diverse population of Rome. By including the local gods and rituals in Roman religion, Numa was able to show his subjects that he respected their beliefs and customs. This created a sense of loyalty and goodwill that helped to strengthen his rule. Another example of Numa's pragmatic approach to religion was his emphasis on the importance of festivals and public celebrations. Numa knew that the people of Rome needed something to look forward to, something to give them hope and joy in the midst of a often difficult and dangerous life. By introducing new festivals and encouraging people to participate in them, Numa was able to create a sense of community and shared identity among the citizens of Rome. These festivals were not just a distraction from the hardships of everyday life. They were an integral part of Roman religion, and they played an important role in maintaining social order and harmony. For example, the Ludi Romani, or Roman games, were a major part of Roman religious life. These games were held in honor of Jupiter, and they included chariot races, athletic competitions, and theatrical performances. The games were a time for the people of Rome to come together and celebrate their city and their gods. It was a chance for them to escape the pressures of everyday life and to enjoy themselves in the company of their friends and neighbors. Rome's strength came not only from its armies, but also from the favor of the gods. He understood that the gods were a powerful force that could be used to enhance Rome's power and influence. So he made every effort to keep them on Rome's side. One way he did this was through the establishment of the Flamens, a group of priests whose duty it was to maintain the sacred fire that symbolized the presence of the gods in the city. The Flamens were not only responsible for keeping the fires burning, but they also served as advisors to the king on matters of religion. They were highly respected in Roman society, and their input was highly valued. In addition to the Flamens, Numa also established the Vestal Virgins, a group of women who were dedicated to the service of the goddess Vesta. Their main duty was to keep the sacred fire burning in the temple of Vesta, and they were required to live a pure life and remain virgins until their 30th year. The Vestal Virgins were highly respected in Roman society, and their service was considered a great honor. They were given special privileges, and their opinions were valued. Numa's approach to religion brought a sense of calm and order to the people of Rome. The rituals and festivals he introduced provided a steady rhythm to their lives, a rhythm that was essential to the maintenance of social order and harmony. This rhythm was not just a distraction from the hardships of everyday life. It was an integral part of Roman religion, and it played an important role in maintaining social order and harmony. So Numa's idea that Rome's strength came not only from its armies, but also from the favor of the gods, was not just a religious belief. It was a practical and pragmatic philosophy that guided his every move as king of Rome. He understood that the gods were a powerful force that could be used to enhance Rome's power and influence, and he made every effort to keep them on Rome's side. Thank you for watching this episode. Please leave your comments and suggestions down below, and check out the links in the description for ways to support my work. See you next time. Hello once again, my friends. Welcome to our channel, where we are exploring the series Ancient History Explained. And in this episode we're going to look at Chapter 8, Sacred Rituals and Festivals. So let's get started. Numa was a legendary king of Rome who reigned from about 713 to 673 BCE, according to Livy's account. But Dionysius of Halicarnassus places him later in the 6th century BCE, during the period of the Republic. Be that as it may, Numa is credited with introducing many religious practices and rituals into Roman society. The first thing he did was to introduce rituals for the 12 gods of the Roman pantheon. He also established festivals for the seasons and for agriculture, such as the Consualia in honor of the goddess of harvest, as well as for the months of the year. This reform was significant because it helped to organize Roman religion around a central set of deities and holidays. It also provided a way to mark the passage of time and the cycles of nature. He then ordered the construction of several temples in the city of Rome, such as those dedicated to Januarius, the god of beginnings, and to the Dioscuri, the twin brothers Castor and Pollux, associated with horseback riding and the arts of peace. He also established a number of other sacred boundaries around the city, such as the Pomerium, which was a sacred precinct surrounding the city walls, and the Vicus Caprarius, which was a sacred street where goats were sacrificed. These boundaries helped to define the sacred space within which Roman religious practices took place. They also served as reminders of the gods to whom the Romans were supposed to be faithful. Then he established temple rites for each of the 30 tribes of Rome, and created a college of 200 priests called the Ludi Romani. He also made sacrifices to the Lares, the household gods, and to the Pinetes, the gods of the pantry or cellar. He was also responsible for creating the Flamona class of priests who were married and had families, unlike the other priests who were celibate. One notable Flamen was the Flamen Dialis, who was the chief priest of Jupiter Optimus, the chief god of the Roman pantheon. He wore a distinctive white hat and was not allowed to shave his head, body, or beard. Numa also continued the practice of divination, which was the practice of interpreting signs from the gods, such as by examining the flight of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals. He also established a number of festivals that celebrated various aspects of Roman life and religion, such as the Ludi Romani or Roman Games, which were a festival of theater and music in honor of Apollo and Minerva. He also established the Consualia festival of the harvest and the Floralia, a festival of flowers in honor of the goddess Flora. However, Numa did not only introduce new religious practices and rituals, he also reformed existing ones. For example, he changed the Roman calendar so that it had 10 months instead of 8, and he also added 2 months, January and February. He also ordered the construction of a new temple for the goddess Luna, and he established a college of priestesses called the Vestal Virgins, who were in charge of keeping the sacred fire of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, burning. It was also under Numa's reign that the Romans made contact with the Etruscans, an ancient civilization that lived in central Italy and were known for their art and their religious beliefs. The Romans learned much from the Etruscans, including their alphabet and their system of divination. In fact, Numa's wife, Tatia, was said to have been an Etruscan princess who brought her own religious traditions with her when she married Numa. One of these traditions was the worship of the god Terminus, who was a boundary god similar to the Greek god Hermes. Numa built a temple for Terminus near the Forum, the center of Roman public life, and this temple became one of the most important religious sites in Rome. Another thing that Numa did was to establish a number of holy days, or dies in some cases, meaning days of religious significance. These dies were spread throughout the year and they commemorated various events such as the founding of the city of Rome or the victories of Roman armies. They were also occasions for celebrating the gods and for making sacrifices to them. One of the most important dies was the dies natalis, which was the birthday of a person or a city. For example, the birthday of Rome was celebrated on April, which was also the day of the Ludi Romani or Roman Games. These games were a major festival that lasted 5 days and featured theatrical performances, musical competitions, and athletic events. These were all part of Numa's efforts to make Rome a more civilized and sophisticated city. He wanted to make it a center of culture and religion, not just a military outpost. His reforms had a lasting impact on Roman society, and they helped to shape the cultural and religious landscape of the ancient world. Let's talk now about the establishment of sacred boundaries. You see, in addition to the religious practices and rituals that Numa introduced or reformed, he also paid attention to the physical spaces where these activities took place. He understood that the success of his reforms depended not only on the people's willingness to follow new customs, but also on the environment in which those customs were performed. Therefore, he made sure to create and maintain sacred areas that were separate from the rest of the city and were dedicated exclusively to religious purposes. For example, he established the Pomerium, which was a sacred precinct that surrounded the city walls. This area was considered to be the domain of the gods, especially of the goddess Roma, who was the personification of the city itself. No one was allowed to enter the Pomerium without sacrificing a goat, and it was forbidden to do anything impure there, such as killing an animal or burying a corpse. The Pomerium was also decorated with statues of the gods and with other symbols of power and glory. It was meant to impress visitors and remind the Romans of their duty to respect and honor their gods. Another example of Numa's concern for the physical spaces of religion was the Vicus Caprarius, which was a sacred street where goats were sacrificed. This street was located near the Forum Magnum or Great Forum, which was the main square of ancient Rome. It was here that the most important political and social events took place, such as elections, trials, and public speeches. By placing a sacred space right next to the center of public life, Numa showed how important religion was to him and how it should permeate every aspect of Roman society. In addition to these two examples, there were other sacred boundaries that Numa established or confirmed, such as the limits of the fields where the Vestal Virgins performed their sacred duties, or the areas where different tribes could sacrifice their animals to their patron deity. These boundaries were not just physical lines or markers, but they were also symbolic representations of the relationship between humans and gods. They were meant to create a sense of order, purity, and holiness in the midst of a bustling city. By establishing these boundaries, Numa showed that he was a king who cared not only about the spiritual needs of his people, but also about the material conditions that made those needs possible. He was a pragmatic and practical ruler who knew that religion was not just a matter of faith and rituals, but also of space and time. Finally, let us discuss how these rituals gave Romans a sense of stability in times of change and uncertainty. You see, Numa came to power at a time when Rome was experiencing rapid changes and challenges. The city had recently expanded its territory and influence beyond the Latium region, and it had encountered new peoples, cultures, and ideas. At the same time, Rome was also facing internal problems, such as conflicts between the patricians and the plebeians, the rich and the poor, and the need to integrate new citizens into the political system. In the face of these changes and challenges, the Romans needed a way to cope with the uncertainty and anxiety that they caused. And they found that way in the rituals and festivals that Numa introduced and promoted. These rituals were not just empty and meaningless repetitions of the past. They were actually responses to the present and projections into the future. They provided a framework of regularity and predictability that helped the Romans to navigate their changing world. For example, the seasonal festivals such as the Consualia or the Floralia reminded the Romans of the cycles of nature and the rhythms of life. They celebrated the abundance of the harvest or the beauty of spring, and they gave thanks to the gods for their blessings. These festivals were not only a way to connect with the past, but also a way to plan for the future. They helped the Romans to predict when certain crops would ripen or when certain plants would bloom, and they encouraged them to prepare accordingly. Similarly, the monthly festivals such as the Ludi Romani or the Dies Natalis reinforced the importance of time and the passage of years. They marked the anniversaries of important events in Roman history or the birthdays of important figures in Roman mythology. These festivals were a way to commemorate the heroes and founders of Rome and to reaffirm their values and traditions. They also served as reminders of the duties and obligations that the Romans had towards their gods and their ancestors. Overall, the rituals and festivals that Numa established and supported helped to create a sense of community and identity among the Romans. They were occasions for people to gather together, to express their piety and patriotism, and to enjoy the company of their fellow citizens. They were also moments of catharsis and release, when people could temporarily escape from their everyday concerns and immerse themselves in the realm of the supernatural. Through these rituals and festivals, the Romans could reaffirm their faith in their gods, their confidence in their kingship, and their hope for the future of their city. Alright, welcome to Chapter 9 of our series covering the kings of Rome. If you're new here, welcome, and if you're returning, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the last video on the great warrior King Camillus, and I hope you'll stick around for more. In the last episode we talked about the long reign of King Camillus, which ended with him dying of old age after 7.5 decades on the throne. He was succeeded by his son-in-law who took the name Numa. You might remember from our previous videos that Numa is one of the few kings whose exact dates are known, because he left behind an inscription with his regnal years carved on a stone pillar, so we know that he reigned from 713 to 673 BC, which means that his reign lasted for 40 years. That's already pretty impressive. But there's one thing that makes his reign even more remarkable. Numa Pompilius was the only king of Rome to rule for so long without a single war. Yeah, this guy spent 4 whole decades cultivating peace. It's actually crazy when you think about it. Rome's existence at this point depended on having a strong military, because they were surrounded by hostile tribes and their neighbors had made it clear that they wanted Rome destroyed. Yet Numa managed to avoid war with all of them. Now you're probably wondering how in the world did he do this? Well, let's find out together. One story that illustrates how peaceful Numa's reign was is told by Livy, who opens book 1 of his history with a famous anecdote. According to Livy, one day while Numa was walking around the fields near the city, he came across 2 brothers who were tending to their flocks of sheep. The older brother was from the neighboring tribe of the Etruscans, and the younger brother was Latin. Just like Numa, when the Latin brother saw the king, he dropped everything and ran away as fast as he could. The Etruscan brother, though, just looked at Numa and said, "Don't you recognize me?" Startled by this boldness, Numa asked him who he was, to which the man replied, "I am thy enemy." At this point, Numa got angry and prepared to fight, but the Etruscans' men laughed and said, "What are you doing? Do you really think you can fight us? We have weapons and you don't." Then the Etruscan went over to the other side of the river, grabbed his spear and shield and tossed them on the ground before him. He then commanded Numa to do the same. Once he had disarmed himself, the Etruscan picked up both of their weapons and crossed the river to return them to the other man, and after they had both received their weapons, the brothers continued on their way. Now, the point of this story is to describe a battle between two brothers who drop their weapons and make up after some intense staring. No, the point is to show how intimidating Numa was. Even though he didn't want to fight, his mere presence was enough to scare off his enemies. In fact, according to Livy, the Etruscans and Latins both knew of Numa's great power, and would never have dared attack him if he was unallied with the other Italian tribes. They would have been utterly crushed. It's also worth noting that this is Livy's explanation for why the Romans kept their weapons on the left side of their body, since the Latin in this story disarmed first, and was therefore forced to use his right hand to pick up his weapons off the ground. However, I'm not sure how much merit there is to this explanation, but let's get back to the topic at hand. What was so impressive about Numa's reign was that he expanded the borders of the Roman kingdom during his reign. He even went as far as conquering the territory of the Etruscans, the very people who were supposedly so intimidated by him that they made peace instead of going to war. He accomplished this through diplomacy, because the secret to Numa's success was that he believed waging endless wars would destroy Rome. Instead, he chose to build alliances with Rome's neighbors, believing that they could prosper by working together. He famously said, "Not even the greatest glory of Rome, the valor of her people in arms, has shone so brightly as the peaceful art and the increase of population under my rule." And what's amazing about this quote is how true it is. For example, under Camillus, Rome was still fighting to defend itself, but once peace had been established, Rome was free to grow. During Numa's reign, the population of Rome grew from around 100,000 to 400,000 people. That's an incredible feat, and it shows just how prosperous Rome was during this period. Another thing that helped him keep the peace was that he sent ambassadors to all the neighboring tribes to negotiate treaties and alliances. This included the Etruscans, the Latins, the Aqui, the Volsci, the Hanici, and the Sabines. These alliances were mutually beneficial because it meant that all these tribes would help each other out in times of need. And most importantly, none of them would ever wage war against each other again. Numa also worked to improve relations with Greece. You see, he sent a delegation to Athens to ask for the philosopher Pythagoras to come teach the Romans about numbers and geometry. This was a huge step forward because it showed that Numa was open to learning from other cultures. He also invited Greek merchants to come to Rome and trade, which led to the establishment of a permanent Greek colony in the city. This colony was made up of merchants, artisans, philosophers, and scholars who all contributed to the cultural and economic development of Rome. It's no exaggeration to say that without the Greeks, Rome wouldn't have become the superpower it did later on. And speaking of culture, Numa also founded several important institutions during his reign, including the Pontifex Maximus, which was the highest religious office in Roman society. He also established the Lupercal Cave as a sacred site, where the she-wolf that suckled Romulus and Remus was said to have lived, and he created the festival of Lupercalia in honor of the she-wolf. He also created the College of the Arval Brethren, which was a secret society of priests dedicated to the worship of the goddess of fertility, whom the Romans called Tatia. But anyway, I won't go into all the lewd details. Let's just say it was a bit naughty. But seriously, despite being a devout worshipper of traditional Roman deities, Numa was also tolerant of other religions and even built temples to the gods of the Etruscans and Greeks. He basically wanted everyone to get along and be friends. So yeah, looking at all these accomplishments, it's easy to see why Livy thought so highly of Numa, and Livy wasn't alone. In fact, the Romans revered Numa as a great king. In fact, the word numerable comes from the name Numa, because the Romans believed that he had established a golden age of peace and prosperity. Virgil, the famous Roman poet, even wrote an entire poem about Numa's reign, which was considered required reading for Roman youths until late antiquity. But honestly, it's hard to believe that such a peaceful time actually existed in ancient Rome, because most sources agree that those were some of Rome's most glorious years. And when you compare them to what came before and what came after, it makes the situation even more ironic. You see, Rome's early kings were constantly at war, as they struggled to unite Italy under their rule. And afterwards, Rome would go on to conquer the entire Mediterranean, starting with the destruction of Carthage. So when you think about it, the only reason why those glorious years even happened was because there was this one king who decided to pursue peace instead of conquest. Of course we should take this with a grain of salt because many historians agree that Numa's reign was likely a bit more violent than the sources make it seem, especially considering that he supposedly waged war on the Etruscans, and Livy's account of how Numa became king also contains some serious plot holes. I talk about that in our last video, so go watch that if you haven't yet. But even if he did engage in warfare, it's clear that his top priority was always peace. And that's why I thought this topic was worth discussing, because sometimes I think we forget how fragile peace is and how easily it can be destroyed. I mean, just look at how quickly things can turn sour in the comment section when someone says something that other people do and like. Anyway, thanks for watching. Don't forget to leave a thumbs up, subscribe and hit the bell notification, and I'll see you next time. This channel presents a history of Rome, Chapter 10 Wisdom, Philosophy and Influence. When Numa Pompilius became king of Rome in 713 BCE, it was not a great moment to be alive in Rome. Rome was a tiny city of just a few thousand people, surrounded by powerful neighbors, who would regularly beat them up and occasionally sack the city. In these circumstances, most Romans were probably looking for a king who could lead them to military glory, like the legendary Romulus or even Aeneas before him. So Numa wasn't the kind of king they wanted, but he was definitely the king they needed. Numa was influenced by Greek philosophy and religion, especially that of his mother, Sabine tradition, but the Greeks did not have a monopoly on wisdom. The Sabines were also well known for their wisdom and their religious practices. Their main deity was a local goddess named Ops, similar to the Greek goddess Demeter and later identified with the Roman goddess Ceres. Sabine women played an important role in the founding of the Roman state, and Numa's mother, a Sabine princess named Orestilla, is said to have introduced many Sabine customs to Rome. One such custom was the festival of Lupercalia held in February or March. During this festival, young men would run around the Palatine Hill while half-naked women ran after them, slapping them with leather thongs. If you're wondering why, I don't really know. It's a fertility festival. The point is, there was plenty of ancient Roman wisdom that had nothing to do with Greece. We only have a vague idea of what Numa actually did as king, because he was written out of the history books by later Romans who considered him too weak and ineffectual to be a true founder of Rome. Most of our information about him comes from the pages of Livy and Plutarch, whose histories are more concerned with moral instruction than historical accuracy. According to these sources, Numa was a wise and gentle king who favored diplomacy over war. He refused to go to war against the Etruscans and instead negotiated a peace treaty with them. He also refused to attack the neighboring Latins when they were being attacked by the Valsi, and he didn't even try to stop the Valsi from pillaging on the Sabine territory. This is not exactly the behavior we expect from a strong Roman king. It might be more appropriate for a philosopher king like Numa is often depicted as. In fact, Numa was one of the very few kings in Roman history who held any philosophical or religious views at all. All of the others were either too busy trying to stay alive or conquering everybody in sight. Numa, however, had time to think about deeper things. He was the patron of the Vestal Virgins and other Roman priests, and he reformed the Roman calendar and introduced many new religious festivals, including the festival of Consualia in honor of the goddess Minerva. Numa's biggest contribution to Roman religion was his creation of the College of the 12 Tables or the Pontiffs, which was a kind of Catholic college responsible for interpreting Roman law and tradition. The Pontiffs were originally 12 men, but later expanded to 20, and they would eventually become one of the most powerful groups in Roman society. They were especially influential during the Republic and the Empire, when they often served as advisors to the emperors. In addition to his religious reforms, Numa also introduced several practical innovations that helped make Rome a more livable city. He built many public buildings and monuments, including the first temple to the deified Romulus and the first Roman basilica. He improved the water supply by building aqueducts to bring fresh water into the city, and he established a mint to produce Roman coins. These reforms may sound rather unremarkable, but keep in mind that Rome was still a very small and backward city in the 7th century BC. Numa was basically building the foundations of a modern city. Now, none of this is to say that Rome became some kind of hippie commune under Numa's rule. There was still slavery and warfare and all the other trappings of an ancient civilization. But there was a growing sense in Rome that there was more to life than just war and conquest. We see this attitude in the character of Cincinnatus, who was a Roman citizen in the 6th century BC. Cincinnatus was a hard-working farmer who lived a simple and honest life. But one day he was called to be dictator, which was a temporary magistrate with absolute power. Because Rome was at war with the Aqui, Cincinnatus led the Roman army to victory and then immediately resigned his dictatorship and went back to his farm. Later, another dictator was appointed to oversee the distribution of booty taken from the enemy, but he took bribes and gave his friends and family most of the plunder. When the people complained to the Senate, the senators said, "If you want your property back, go to Cincinnatus. He will give you your fair share of the spoils." And sure enough, Cincinnatus divided the remaining booty equally among the citizens. From this story, we learn two things. First, ancient Romans could be surprisingly honest. And second, they really liked stories about honest people. After Cincinnatus, Rome was ruled by Tarquinius Priscus, who was either Etruscan or of mixed Etruscan and Latin descent. This guy was a proper king in the traditional Roman mold. He sponsored huge public works projects, fortified Rome's walls, built the Circus Maximus, and hosted lavish banquets for the Roman nobility. In other words, he was the kind of king who made Rome into a real city. He's usually portrayed as a tyrant though, who oppressed the common people, but maybe that's just propaganda spread by his enemies. After all, later Romans seemed to like him well enough to build a temple in his honor next to the temple of Romulus. Next came Salvius Tullius, who supposedly was the son of a slave woman, and may have been of mixed Sabine and Etruscan blood. History is a bit hazy on this guy, too. But we do know that he was responsible for the Servian walls and the Servian census, which reorganized Roman society into 5 classes based on property ownership and wealth. Livy claimed that Serapis Tullius was murdered by his own wife, but Plutarch says he died a natural death and was succeeded by his son Tarquinius Superbis, aka Tarquin the Proud. Tarquin was the last king of Rome, and he was certainly the most notorious. He treated Rome like his personal fiefdom and ruled with the help of his 4 sons, who were as nasty and violent as he was. Rome was fairly prosperous under Tarquin's rule, but the Romans themselves hated his guts. And when his sons tried to put down a revolt, they got chased out of town by the angry mob. Legend has it that after the Tarquins were driven out of Rome in 509 BCE, the Roman people set up a republic with 2 elected officials called consuls who shared the king's former powers. This event is considered the traditional founding of the Roman Republic, and it marks the end of our story. The Tarquin story is obviously extremely important, but it's not necessarily true. We have no evidence that there was a popular uprising against Tarquin, and we have little evidence of the Tarquin dynasty itself. It's possible that Rome simply stopped electing kings after Tarquinius Priscus died, and the whole story about the overthrow of Tarquin the Proud may have been concocted centuries later by Republican leaders who wanted to discredit the monarchy. But regardless of whether the Tarquin story is true, it makes sense as an explanation for the origins of the Roman Republic. But let's go back to Tarquin the Proud. This guy really did exist, and he really was hated by the Romans. Livy described him as cruel, arrogant, and pleasure-loving, and accused him of being addicted to wine, gambling, and sexual promiscuity. Even his appearance was monstrous, with a pale complexion, red hair, and a hunchback. So yeah, Tarquin wasn't exactly the kind of king you'd want to invite to dinner, but he was effective at keeping Rome prosperous and stable, and his successors were unable to do the same. The point is, Rome was a very different city when Tarquin the Proud came to power than it was when Augustus Caesar died. Ancient Rome was a long process with many contributors. Augustus laid the foundations of the empire, but it was the Julio-Claudians who made it a reality. Nero was arguably the greatest Julio-Claudian, but his excesses proved to be a liability. Rome was exhausted by his insanity, and so the empire became a province. Rome had changed, and so had its gods. As much as the Romans loved their Greek culture, they had no patience for their decadent ways. They needed a god that mirrored their values, and they found him in a converted Athenian philosopher. Paul took philosophy out of the gymnasium and put it into the streets. He argued that Jesus Christ was the Messiah predicted by the Jewish prophets, and that salvation was available to Jews and Gentiles alike. This message was revolutionary and highly effective. Within a few decades, Christianity was tearing through the Mediterranean like wildfire. Rome's new ruler saw the writing on the wall. By the end of the 1st century AD, Rome was officially Christian. This transition didn't happen overnight, of course, and paganism continued to thrive in the Roman world for many years. But the die was cast. The old Roman polytheism was dead. So those are the major events of late Republican and early Imperial Rome. As always, if you'd like to know more, check the references. If you enjoyed this series, please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Alright, it's time to wrap up our series on Rome's legendary kings. So let's get to it. Chapter 11, The End of Numa's Reign. Numa Pompilius was an old king by the time he kicked off. According to Livy, he was around 76 when he took the throne, and he ruled for 44 years, meaning he was somewhere between 120 and 130 when he died. If that sounds like a long time to rule, well, that's because it was. In fact, of all the kings of Rome, only his successor would reign longer. But while that may sound impressive, it also means that Numa spent more years in the role than any of the Roman emperors, including Augustus, who many consider to be the true founder of the empire, or Caesar Augustus, the guy who started the whole Julio-Claudian dynasty. All of them were bested by Numa. That's some dedication. But even if it sounds great to be king for that long, it's not so hot if you over 100. And we know that Numa was at least 100, because Dionysius of Halicarnassus says that he died at the ripe old age of 102. To be fair, ancient rulers did tend to live longer than the general population. It doesn't seem to have been due to better nutrition since their diets were pretty similar, but it might have been because they had access to better healthcare. Or maybe the stress of ruling didn't kill them, or at least it didn't kill them young. Whatever the case, it seems to have been common for powerful people in the ancient world to outlive those without power. So what was life like for Numa in his final years? We don't really know. In fact, we don't really know much about his reign at all. Livy tells us that during his last years, he began appointing his son, Pompus, to be his deputy. And this is something that we can corroborate through archaeological evidence. There's an inscription from the year 693 that mentions a dedication in the Lupercal cave made by Marcus Junius Brutus, who dedicated the altar there as a way of showing gratitude for his recovery. This is important because we know from Plutarch's Life of Brutus that he was Numa's son-in-law, having married the king's daughter, and that he was in disgrace with his father-in-law during this period. As such, this inscription shows us that despite reports to the contrary, Pompus was indeed acting as regent for his father. And it also gives us another piece of evidence to suggest that Numa was old and likely sick. If he was completely healthy, it seems unlikely that he would have sent his son-in-law away from the city. But there are two things to keep in mind here. First, this inscription comes from the 6th century, almost 400 years after the supposed events it refers to, so the memory of these events could have become distorted over time. Second, we have no idea why Brutus fell out of favor. It could have been because he made a mistake, or maybe his father-in-law just didn't like him, so we shouldn't jump to conclusions. That said, the theory that Numa was old and sick in his last years does make sense because we know that he named his son as his heir. Rome didn't have a formal system of inheritance like primogeniture, but it's clear from reading the history of the early kings that if you were the king's son, you had a pretty good claim to the throne. And it makes sense that the elderly and sick Numa would want to name his son as his deputy, especially considering that he had to deal with rivals within the Senate. One of these rivals was apparently the augurs, who were upset that he established a college of sacerdotes, a group of full-time religious officials, which took away some of the power that the augurs previously had. They complained to him that he was encroaching on their territory, so he decided to placate them by giving them control of one of the most important festivals of the year, the Lupercalia, celebrated on February, which honored the she-wolf that suckled Romulus and Remus. During Numa's reign, Rome became much more heavily involved in religion. He built the first official temple to the deified Romulus, and he brought in new cults, including those of the Greek gods, though how this went over with the Romans is debatable. Some scholars think that Numa was interested in Greek culture because he was from the Sabine tribe, which had close ties to Greece. Others think that it was because his wife Tatia was Greek. She was the daughter of King Pyrrhus of Athens, and her family apparently thought that she was being treated shabbily by the Romans, so they sent someone to retrieve her. But when the messenger got to Rome, he found that she was pregnant and gave birth while he was there, so he left, only to come back and find that she had taken her own life. This story might be an anachronism though, since none of the sources that mention it name the messenger or say anything about where he came from, so we don't know if he was really from Athens or just some random Greek dude. Another story from this period is the founding of the College of the Arvil Brethren, a secret cult whose members were said to have been chosen by Numa himself. We don't know if this group actually existed during Numa's reign, or if it was created later, but it certainly played a big role in the later Republic. Its main duty was to oversee the Sibylline books, a collection of prophecies that were kept in a special building called the Aedes Sibyl. These books weren't super popular at first, but they gained favor in the 3rd century BCE, after the destruction of the original set by a fire. which some interpreted as divine retribution for Rome's decision to go to war with the Senate. So the Sibylline books became super important for Roman religion and were consulted before major decisions. This is a key part of the story of the books, but it isn't part of our story. Numa's death was peaceful. It wasn't violent, and there wasn't a civil war or anything like that. According to Livy, after 44 years of peace, he died happy and satisfied with how he ruled, and his son, Pompus, succeeded him without issue. Unfortunately for Pompus, he was born into a position where he could never live up to his father's legacy. Numa was remembered as the good king, the one who brought prosperity and peace to Rome and established its institutions. So no matter what he did, he would always be seen as the king's son. The Romans mourned Numa's passing, both at the time and for centuries afterwards. His successor's mother, Alia, tried to console him, saying that he should take comfort in knowing that Numa was happy with him, but he still threw himself on the ground, lamenting the loss of his father. Later on, poets wrote about his accomplishments and people visited his tomb. Even the Vestal Virgins were said to grieve his death. Sometime after Numa's death, according to tradition, someone broke into his tomb and stole his books. Livy says that it was because the Romans were ashamed that their king had been killed by lightning, so they tried to hide evidence of it. But Dionysius says that it was the ghost of Numa who came to retrieve his books, so that they could be buried with him. Either way, they found his body still preserved in the tomb, but they only found a few bones. The rest of his remains were gone, which they interpreted as signs that his spirit had ascended to heaven. From there, he was deified and became a god of agriculture, and a temple was built for him on the Janiculum Hill. There's also a tradition that during the Middle Republic, the Sibylline books were stolen, but then the ghost of Numa appeared and led the senators to where they were hidden. Of course, this story may have been invented to explain how the books were found, but either way, it shows how the Romans viewed Numa as almost divine, even though he wasn't considered a god until much later. And that brings us to the end of this series. I'm your host, and I've been covering the legendary kings of Rome for this channel. Check out the playlist to watch the rest of the episodes if you haven't already. Next week we'll start our coverage of Rome's first emperor, Augustus. But in the meantime, here's a little sneak peek at next week's episode, the end of the Republic. Now I know I say this every time, but I really mean it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of my videos. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please like and share it. You can also check me out on social media or at my website. Until next time, stay classy, Rome. This is the History of Rome, Chapter 12, Numa's Eternal Legacy. In this episode, we are gonna look at some of the ways that Numa Pompilius affected Roman society long after his death. And as always, if you would like to know more, check out the series linked below. Also, thank you so much to our supporters. You make these videos possible. As I think about Numa and how he affected Rome, there are three areas that stand out for me. There's his work with the laws, his work with religion, and finally, his contribution to peace. First, let's talk about his work with the laws. In Livy's account, which is our main source for this episode, Numa is basically a civilian. He didn't really do much outside of the city. And while he did engage in a little bit of expansionism, his focus was primarily on administration and bringing order to the growing city. This is really apparent in his legal code, which is summarized for us by Dionysius of Tatia. According to this passage from Dionysius, Numa worked to adjust penalties to fit the crime, which sounds like he established a sort of graduated system of punishments. This might not sound like a big deal, but this was very different from what Rome had known before. Under the kingship of Romulus, where the laws were harsh and left no room for interpretation. I want to read this passage from Dionysius because it summarizes Numa's legislative accomplishments pretty well. He also enacted regulations for weights and measures and settled many lawsuits by arbitration rather than litigation, believing that litigation caused many injustices and hardships. He prohibited the buying and selling of slaves born in Italy and freedmen of 1 year's standing from being sold again. He made it lawful for daughters to inherit from their fathers if they had no brothers and allowed women to own property, which had been forbidden previously. He carefully considered all matters pertaining to religion and made laws for the state and country. He founded the 4 major festivals of the Roman people, the Lupercalia, the Floralia, the Metralia, and the Quinquatria. He organized the college of priests and assigned each god or goddess a special precinct, house, or temple. He divided the patricians into 6 classes and called them centuries from the number of their houses and enrolled them in the census. He assigned senators to watch over and guard the tribunes while they were making laws and prohibited them from passing any unjust or unconstitutional laws. He also appointed 2 military tribunes to assist the generals and ordered that no man should hold office for more than 2 successive years. To prevent tyranny, he transferred the patrician census record to the custody of the tribunes, since they represented the whole body of the people, that the records might be in the hands of the people rather than of the king. And he built the Temple of Janus as a special shrine for the deified Romulus, and as a place where treaties of peace might be deposited and preserved. So as you can see, most of what Numa did was to put things into place, build up institutions to help run the city. But what about war? Well, that brings us to our second category, religion. Numa was seen as a priest king, someone who focused a lot on religious matters. When he took the throne, he noticed that the citizens of Rome were too warlike, and he tried to get them to be more pious. He emphasized the importance of treaties, making them in some cases binding religious obligations, and he set up sanctuaries throughout the city and in the countryside that were meant to limit bloodshed. These sanctuaries are described for us by Plutarch. According to Plutarch, Pneumatists made the grove of the goddess Diana near the city sacred, forbidding anyone from shedding blood there. He also made a sanctuary of the god Terminus at every boundary, in the marketplace, at the fords, on the roads, and even around altars. He forbade killing within javelin range of an altar. He made a law that no one should take another's life in cold blood, that is, without provocation. He laid an obligation of piety upon those who held public office, that they should duly celebrate the birthdays of the gods according to the course of the year, and he made the month of January sacred to the deified Romulus, establishing the festival of his apotheosis, that is, the celebration of his becoming a god. So here we see that Numa's attempts to change Roman culture are mostly limited to trying to bring them closer to religion. He doesn't try to change the Roman character, but rather hopes to guide them towards peacefulness through the practice of piety. And it seems to have worked, because the third area of Numa's legacy has to do with peace. It is said that during his reign, Rome knew no wars, and that his ability to make and keep treaties was unparalleled. In fact, he is credited with having made Rome's first treaty with the Etruscans, which established peace between the two powers and led to a general peace throughout central Italy for 5 generations. That's 200 years. Livy calls this period a somnia mundi, a dream of peace. But that isn't to say that there were no conflicts during this time. Rather, it means that large-scale warfare was a thing of the past. Here is how Livy describes it. No hostile arms were used by any Italian people against any other Italian people, nor was any embassy dispatched beyond the Italian borders, except embassies to demand the restoration of property or to conclude an alliance, and these were sent only to neighboring states. Thus, the whole of central Italy enjoyed a quiet and peaceful state of liberty under Numa, thanks to the example of Rome. If any other state attempted anything rash or haughty, Rome stood ready to punish them, and so it came about that all the states of central Italy joined in celebrating the triumphs and festivals of Rome and sending their ambassadors to do so. So here we see that Rome is still very much engaged with the surrounding states. But instead of fighting, they are working together for the common good, and Livy points out that the other Italian states willingly participate with Rome, seeing them as a positive influence. So what Numa does, he establishes a kind of hegemony over central Italy, a position of authority that Rome will only grow out of in the Republic. Now, if you're catching the sarcasm here, you are absolutely right. What we have just seen are the ways that Numa changed Rome and central Italy. We saw his work with the laws, his work with religion, and his contribution to peace. But the reality is that all of this is myth. Numa never existed. The sources for his life are non-existent, and all of this needs to be understood in the context of Rome in the late Republic. So why should we care about this myth? Why is it important to understand Numa in the period when he appears, that is the late Republic? Well, because it's clear that Romans themselves looked back at Numa as the model of wisdom. He was everything that Augustus wished to be, a peaceful ruler who brought prosperity and security to Rome, and it's easy to see why Romans looked to Numa so fondly. In Livy's histories, he is presented as the ideal passive king, someone who brought prosperity and peace simply by setting things up properly, in the right way. The idea being that once the machinery of government was in place, once the laws were written down, once the temples were built, then Rome could basically run itself, and its citizens could enjoy freedom and peace. And given that Livy wrote during a time of civil war, that was a pretty attractive idea. I hope you enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun doing it. Also, thank you so much to our supporters. Your support helps us make these videos better and better. Thank you guys so much. And as always, if you would like to know more, check out the series linked below. Thanks for watching.